Check, check. Good morning, everybody. Hope y'all are doing well. Hope you're enjoying the rain, the nice cold rain, and hope you got some rest this weekend because you couldn't get outside and do anything. So hopefully you got to kind of hang out, watch some football, or watch daytime television. I don't know, whatever you watch, and just rest. But it's been a nice weekend. We've had a lot going on this weekend, just with Halloween stuff and Middle on the Move and lots of different things. And then we've, of course, got the hayride at the Halls tonight. So we're excited about that. And that is for everybody, if you didn't know that. Everybody's welcome to come to that. And we hope that we have a good turnout for that. And Lord willing, the weather will be as nice as it is, or maybe a little nicer. So hopefully you can come to that tonight. We're excited about today. I love this story. I posted on Facebook that we are going to be going through the story of Noah and the flood, and I really hope that you familiarized yourself with this text, because we don't have time to read the story today. That would pretty much take the entire class time. So hopefully you're familiar enough with this text that we can talk about it in general, and I can get your comments on it and things like that. If not, I would encourage you to kind of scan through it as we talk about it today. You'll find it in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. But then in chapter 10, Leslie Joe was calling me out earlier, chapter 10 is the genealogy. And we might talk about the genealogy next week. I don't know if we'll talk about that or skip it. I'll make that call this week. But we might get into that. So talking about Noah and the flood, and just like every single story that we've looked at in Genesis, one of the things that I hope you've noticed is that these stories are weird, and they're bizarre, and they're different. They're not your average stories that you sit down and read. But the reason that they're kind of weird for us, and the reason that they're kind of hard to swallow at times, is because, remember, as we've talked about since we've started this study, we're reading it from a Western perspective. We're reading it from a scientific perspective. We're reading it from our cultural perspective. And so what we're trying to do is move windows, look at it from an Eastern perspective in the sense, and balance out the two and read it with a fresh set of eyes. And so right off the bat here, when you read this story, I want you to think about what are the issues? What's weird to you? What is wrong? When you read the story of Noah, when you think about the story of Noah, we want to ask ourselves, what kind of problems do we see? What jumps out to you when you look at this story? Anything? What bothers you with this story? Yeah, Sharon. Okay, so you get this phrase, but Noah found favor in the eyes of God. Nobody else. Yeah, you have this really harsh phrase that every inclination of the human heart was evil, and that God regretted making mankind. Like, just really hard phrases to hold on to and to read. Like, every inclination? Like, is this it's a bizarre statement, and that should jump out to you. But then the text says, but Noah, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Like, was Noah really the only guy? Was it really every single thought and every single, inclination evil? And so it's a bizarre, it seems drastic, it seems exaggerated, or maybe just extremely stated, but there it is. What else? Yeah, Amanda.
When it says the word regretted that he had made man, I
Yeah.
always thought, why God has regrets?
Yeah.
So strange.
Yeah.
We don't know, this is going to happen.
Right. So, yeah, there's these statements, and this is definitely one of those stories where you get these bizarre statements, like God regretted something, and then you're going to see here in a minute that God had to remember. Did God forget? What else jumps out to you?
They lived a long time.
So they're living just shy of 1,000 years around this time. Why is that odd to you, Mike? like, who would want to live that long? Like, I don't know if they probably looked 5 when they were 100, or had the health of a 5-year-old when they were 100. Who knows? But it's this bizarre things going on, right? Anything else jump out to you in this story? Anything else seem weird to you in this story? There's a big one that I'm waiting on, Sharon.
Well, I'm not scientific.
Keep going.
I was curious that it said the water was coming from the earth and down.
We'll talk about that here in just a second. That's a cool one.
Wasn't that the first time that it rained?
First time that yes, rain, that you actually have like this vision of rain or this idea of rain, yeah? What else? Anything bother you about this story? I'm waiting for a big one here. There's giants, right? Yeah.
Taking a bunch of animals on a boat is just like, the whole thing is just bizarre.
The whole thing is bizarre. I don't know if you've gone to see the ark that the guy built. I saw an ironic story. The ark was flooding. It was an ironic, weird, article. It's like, the ark is flooding because there's so much rain. It's like, awkward. Anybody, what bothers you about this story? That God killed everybody? Does that not bother you? I mean, I was waiting for it. Like, everybody's like, no, I'm good with it. I'm cool with it. I'm fine with it. But does that not rub you the wrong way a little bit? To me, there's a few things that just bother me. James?
Well, it helps when you find, doesn't the Bible say that Jesus went back and ministered to them even before the flood?
Okay, so that's a whole different, yeah. Okay. All right, yeah, so like in the realm of Sheol and all that, yeah, that's a whole different talk, yeah. All right, so there's just a lot of different things within this story and hopefully within the Cain and Abel story, within the Adam and Eve story that are just different. They're just bizarre. And this story talks about how the earth is corrupt and God saw how corrupt the earth was. And it seems odd that it's no longer just people that are corrupt, but now the earth is corrupt because what did God call the earth? Good, right? So it's like one of the things that you notice as you look through Genesis 1 through 11 is that evil is starting to grow. It starts with people and then it expands to their children and then it expands outward. And it's as if it has covered the whole earth at this point. It's almost like Mordor, and it's like spreading. The darkness is spreading, and it's this idea of, I'm going to butcher my Lord of the Ring references here. But evil starts out as an individual, this figure that we have in Genesis chapter 2, 3, and then it moves to a family, and then it just spreads and spreads and spreads. And so the other one, the biggest question in my mind is, why would God go and destroy the world? Why would God kill pretty much everything he's created? Because we've been talking about all these stories about this God that is loving and gracious, and you keep seeing these acts of grace time and time and time again. Like even in the garden, an act of grace. Even with Cain, an act of grace, even though he killed his brother. Like this God is a gracious God. And so it seems like a shift, like a 180 turn here in the fact that he's going to wipe everybody and everything out with the exception of these animals and this guy and his family. Lonnie?
I've often wondered at this time, where all did people inhabit the earth? At the time of the flood, was what we call the United States now, North America, was that affected and killed people here? Were people here?
I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue.
At that time, just how widespread was all of this violence?
Apparently it was everywhere. If you take the story literally and you want to read it that way, then it's everywhere. And obviously, there's been a lot more people prior to chapter 6. You get to that. Adam and Eve have had a lot more sons. Everybody's having kids. The giants are on earth, and it's just this bizarreness taking place. And think about this. I need to mention this because this is always been weird to me. This is the most popular VBS story that we have within churches. Like, how dark-minded are we? Like, do we not need to like think about? Yeah. So it's like we take one of the most horrific stories in human history, and we're like, let's teach it to children. You know, so we put a good, nice spin on it. We're like, then God wiped everybody out. You know, and so we make songs and fun stuff about it. That doesn't seem to bother you. That bothers me. Maybe we're on different planes here. But here's something you need to understand, okay? Flood stories were not unique to the Bible. Flood stories were not unique to the only story that you know. There were flood stories all over the ancient world and the Eastern world. There are Babylonian flood stories. There are Chaldean flood stories. There are Mesopotamian flood stories, Sumerian flood stories. There's even an Egyptian flood story. And this is so important for you to realize. Flood stories were almost a part of every culture and their understanding of their origins and where they came from. And everybody, it's seemingly every culture had a flood story, which most of those flood stories predate the book of Genesis. They predate the story that we have. So we're dealing with stories that were in their region, stories that were from their culture, stories that they are familiar with when they first initially read this story, which can mean a couple things. A lot of people have talked about what's called historical cultural memory, which means every single culture talks about a story or an event that leads to some historians to ask the question, well, did something actually happen then? Which I think I would conclude, like, yeah, if every culture in human history is talking about a flood, then maybe there was a flood. Maybe there's something to this story. Like, how did everybody just come up with the same story with similarities, you know, and put their own twist on it? So there's that part of it. But even more important to our study is the literary structure of Genesis. And exactly like we looked at with Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 and 2, these are stories that the author of Genesis is retelling that they're using, and that's going to help us answer the question here that we have. Whoa, never mind. I need a bigger podium here. It's going to help us answer the question here of, why did God destroy the world? Why did God just destroy all of humanity? And that's an important question to think about. And if it doesn't bother you when you read this story, then you're not going to ask that question. But it bothers me, so I ask that question. Why did God wipe everybody out? And the answer to that is, a part of the answer to that is, of course, because that's the story they're used to. That's the story that's been handed down to them. That's the story that they know. That is the story that they were told as kids, this flood story. That's the story that they've grown up with. Now, I'm not going to sit here and debate fiction or nonfiction. I've already given you my opinion on that. I believe that a flood happened. That's not the intent of the story that we have in Genesis 6 through 9. That is not the reason we are given this story, is to debate whether it actually happened or didn't happen. And if you ask those questions of this text, you will miss what God is trying to show you through this story. You with me? Can we be on the same page as we move forward here? We don't want to ask those questions of this story as we read it. So, like I said, the fact that there are so many flood stories tells me that there probably was a flood at some point in human history, and the fact that so many other New Testament authors point to it, but that's not the point. Every culture had its flood story where the gods tried to destroy the world through a great catastrophe, through a great deluge. Yeah, Jay?
I was just going to say the same thing with creation.
Right.
Basically, this is an opportunity for the people of Israel to tell how their God is different than everybody else's.
Right. So we talked about a couple of these when we went through Genesis 1 and 2, and that's exactly right. Jay's right. Like, this is Moses, or the author of Genesis' opportunity to show them what the one true God looks like. So, like I said, a lot of cultures, most cultures had their flood story. One of them is the Sumerian story, which predates the Genesis writing by, a solid 1,000 years, if not more. And it's also intriguing because the characters in the Sumerian story are the exact same names as the characters of Genesis. So the main character is Noah, and then the sons Japheth, Shem, and Ham. The other story that's really relevant is the story from Mesopotamian literature, which is something that's really well known for any ancient literature students, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. You've studied that in college, and it's really well known within theologian circles, and it's studied a lot, and many of us have probably heard of it. Maybe you've even studied it at some point, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest recorded pieces of literature that we have. It is stories that we have from that piece of human history, that piece of humanity, that part of humanity that in this Middle Eastern world. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh is about the hero named Gilgamesh, who's on this journey, and he's on this journey through this world in which he encounters many different gods of Mesopotamia. And during the course of meeting these gods, almost every single meeting goes with a similar plot line. Like all the plot lines kind of play out the same. He meets the god, he discovers the god, who the god is, and what the god is trying to do, and what the god wants. And that's kind of how they each play out. And the god is ultimately going to get angry and try to lash out at either Gilgamesh or at humanity as a whole. That's kind of how it plays out. And it's funny to me that our movies still play this similar pattern in almost every single movie. This is just how these stories go. Now, at one point in history, we're told about, one point in this story, we're told about a new character, and his name is, I'm going to butcher this, it's Ut-Nefishim. Ut-Nefishim. And Ut-Nefishim meets this god of storm and thunder and of rain. And this god's furious at the world. This god wants to wipe the world out. Does that sound familiar? And so Ut-Nefishim, what he does is he builds a raft. He builds this giant boat, and he puts all the animals of the world on this big barge, and he thinks that he's outsmarted the god of thunder and rain and storms. And he basically, Ut-Nefishim is like, I've saved creation. And he outsmarts the god because he found out about the god's plan, and so he pulled creation out of the brink of destruction right at the end. Sound familiar? And so you have this story that is from Mesopotamia. And what's interesting is that Mesopotamia is another name for Chaldea. Can you remember a person in Genesis that we'll meet soon that's from the region of Chaldea? Who? Abraham. That's right. Abraham. So Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham is from Mesopotamia. Abraham's descendants are going to be the people that receive what story? Noah and the flood. You starting to make the connections here? And so they would have been familiar with this story coming from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so it makes complete sense that the author of Genesis is going to take the very stories that Abraham would have grown up with and rewrite them to tell the world and his descendants, to tell his descendants what the one true God is really like, what Yahweh is really like. And the author of Genesis is trying to say, God is not like the gods that you know. God is not like the gods that you've grown up with. God is not like the gods from other cultures. This God is different. And so as we read through this, which we're not going to read through it, but as we think about this, as we think through this story, that's a question you need to ask. How is this God different? What is it about this God that's different from the other gods that are talked about in human history? That is a question that the author wants you to ask. I don't know if my ear is weird shaped or if this thing was created for somebody with small ears. This thing just keeps bouncing off. Anyways, so that's the point of this story. So the question we confront when reading the biblical flood story is, what is God trying to show us? What is the author trying to show us about him? Why is God trying to destroy humanity? Well, That's what the God of all the flood stories is trying to do, but we're looking for what makes this God different. All right? Now, you remember the phrase, Sharon talked about it, this phrase right at the beginning of the story, every inclination of the human heart was evil, like every single one. That's the idea we get here. And what's interesting to me is that phrase shows up at the beginning of the story, and it's this blanket statement, but then the phrase also shows up, and it's repeated at the end of the flood story here. So the phrase shows up at the beginning, and the phrase shows up at the end, which should tell you something. And what should that tell you? If there's a beginning and an end, what's that mean? There's a middle. And what literary tool did we talk about early on? The chiasm. So again, you have a chiastic structure. You have a chiasm that's being used. It's a literary tool used by these ancient authors to point you to the center. Remember, we folded a piece of paper, and you got your bookends, and then at the middle of the piece of paper is where your treasure is hidden. So you want to find that treasure. So it's like it's going to repeat, and it's going to mirror, and it can mirror in different ways. I put this one up here. You probably can't see it. I made the text small, but I put it up here, structured it up here for you. So it's the same literary tool that's being used over and over and over again throughout Genesis up to this point, and it'll be used from Genesis 1 through 11 as a whole. And so again, just like in Genesis 1, you're going to have a story with repetition. You're going to see numbers that pop up that are going to mirror each other, and numbers that are going to be symbolic of different things. So here you can see this literary chiastic structure in the story of the language, but you can also see it in the numerical structure of this story. And I put that one up here too. So you've got, and this one's even smaller. I'm sorry, I just tried to squeeze it all into one frame. But you've got 7, 7, 40, 150. And then you've got 150, 40, 7, 7. You see how that folds in on itself? And how, so you have the literary structure, which the wording of this story folds in on itself and it mirrors each other, but also you have these numerical values that fold in on themselves, and they're all pointing to the exact same center. Does that not make you excited? This stuff is cool. Like it's amazing to me that we have this, for one, and it's amazing to me that it's been structured this way to point us somewhere. And so I put it up here for you, and what does it point to? What is the verse on the center line when you fold that piece of paper in half? What is the treasure hidden in the field here? Can anybody see it? Chapter 8, first part of verse 1. Somebody read that for us if you can see it.
God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded.
So what is this entire story about, Kristen? What would you pull from that verse as the treasure that the author wants you to know about this God who's different? Word it however you'd like. I'm waiting on Kristen. God remembered us. God cares. This God is different, Jay. Here we go. We're going to talk about this because you're going to see that play out in the literary structure as well. And so the center, the treasure that you find hidden in the open field, and that's kind of the image that you get repeated throughout Scripture. And Jesus tells a parable about this, but God remembered you. These other gods, they want to wipe you out. They don't care about you. This God remembers you, which does bring up the question when I read that, like Amanda pointed out, remembered? Like, was God busy? Like, was God working on, out in his barn and forgot? Like, oh yeah, I sent Noah and the animals and his family. Oh, that's right. I remembered. Just a kind of a bizarre, we won't talk about that. I don't know how to talk about that, but just these different kinds of questions that pop up. And so right here at the center of this chiasm, we'll kind of leave this hanging here, and I want to keep going with this a little bit, exactly what Jay pointed at. You have this chiasm, and it talks about what came over the earth? The wind. He sent a wind over the earth, Jay said the Hebrew word there, the Ruach of God came over the earth and hovered over the waters. You remember this in Genesis chapter 1? Positioned to bring about new life, the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. All right, so you have the Ruach of God hovering over the waters, and then here again is Noah, and we have the Ruach of God coming over the water. It's blowing over the earth, and the earth is currently covered in water. We have what appears now to be a link to the creation narrative. You think they would have picked up on this? You better believe it. It's almost as if a new creation is taking place once again. And we see this new creation language and this new creation symbolism repeated time and time again, specifically of Jesus when he comes on the scene. Now, the moment I start thinking like Jay's thinking, and the moment I start picking up on this creation narrative, I start to see a few things. And I'll just highlight these for you. And they're kind of hard to find, and I can't find all of them, but they're there. And in Jewish literature, they're even more pointed out. But we're not Jews, and we don't have, I'm not going to pull out the Midrash and pull out different things to point you to things. But the moment you start thinking that way, you start looking at it through a new lens, and you notice that what's the next thing Noah's going to do? Well, he's going to open up a window in the ark. And so what happens when you open a window? If it's completely dark inside of an ark, what happens when you open a window? Light and darkness. Light, contrast, darkness. So now you have light and darkness. The very next thing is we're going to be told that the rain stops. And if the rain stops, what does that mean? Well, you have water suspended. You have water below. So you have what? You have the different firmaments. You have, this is the creation narrative repeated in similar language. He's given you similar images here. So you're going to have the water. It's not coming down. It's suspended. You have the water above. You have the water below. You have this vault created. And the very next thing that we're going to have happen is we're told that the dry ground is going to appear. So what is happening here? It's following the roadmap of the creation narrative day by day. And the very next thing that's going to happen is Noah is going to send out a bird, and the bird is going to be in the sky wandering about. So now I have birds in the air. Now I have birds in the air, and and just like that, we are at day 5, and you just keep rolling along. And then the next thing you're going to find out is the very next thing is he sends out this bird, and the dove eventually comes back with an olive branch, and then eventually he sends that dove out, and it doesn't come back. So now we have animals on dry ground. And the very next thing that's going to happen is the ark is going to open, the animals are going to come out, and man is going to come out, and God tells them what? Anybody remember? Be fruitful and multiply. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, you see how the author is structuring this language to pull your mind somewhere else, to pull your mind to, oh, this is new. Like, this is similar. I'm familiar with this. You just read it 6 chapters ago. You should be familiar with it. And so this is about something new happening. So if you have the repeated 6 days here and kind of this structure, what day would you expect next? The Sabbath. You would expect a day of rest. So we should have day 7. We should have, on some level, a Sabbath. That should come next. But instead of that coming next, we have this really weird passage. And I want somebody to read it for us. Just read this whole thing here. Genesis 9, 8 through 17. All right, so as Trey read that, again, anything weird to you? As you read through that, I mean, any like, what do you think? I'm trying to pull an answer out of you without giving you the answer. Can you feel that? Just tell me, what's weird about this? Okay, so there's that again. Like, why is God remembering still? He wouldn't what? Okay, so that's right, okay. If God set you down and said this to you, what are you thinking? Thank you, Dana. We get it, right? Like, Noah's like, okay. Like, I imagine Noah sarcastically is like, yeah, I got it the first time you said it. I didn't need you to repeat it 20,000 times, you know? It's like a kid being chastised. Like, I know, Dad. Like, I know, but I need you to remember. So there's something unique about this just ridiculous repetition. It's just like overkill here, right? You read this and you're like, how many times do I have to read this over and over? Trey? Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, it's like, you read the Bible and it's like, I got to take a coffee break. I need to, yeah, like, I wanted to push this point, right? So, yeah, it's remember my covenant, remember my covenant, remember my covenant. And so you have to ask, why is God repeating himself so much here? Now, what's interesting about the word covenant, it's the Hebrew word berit, and it shows up, anybody want to guess how many times? Pick a lucky number here. 7 is a good choice. 7 times it shows up in the Hebrew here. In the English, it shows up 8, but in the Hebrew, it's only 7. The word for earth is going to show up 7 times in these paragraphs. It's another word that just keeps coming out. It's the word eretz. It shows up 7 times. One of the words that repeats itself quite a bit is the word clouds. It's the Hebrew word anon. I'm just going to show this to you because I highlighted them. So here you go. It doesn't show up in the English 5 times, but it shows up in the English 4 times, but in the Hebrew, anon shows up 5 times. So then you get berit 7 times, earth 7 times, clouds 5 times, and then 3 times you get the word for rainbow. Anything strike you about all these numbers? Yeah, Harry.
I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
Since Noah supposedly wrote Genesis,
Moses. Yeah.
okay, and he wrote this, is this a true story, or is this simply a sequel to what he wrote in the creation?
I don't want to answer that question because that question will sidetrack us and will miss the point of what he's trying to show us. Now, I will answer that question, but let's get to what the treasure is first. Fair?
What I'm wondering is this story, you say is a, so to speak, a copy of all these other stories that were written in other cultures.
Yeah.
Is this one any truer than those stories?
Well, I would say yes, because the truth of this story is it's pointing you to the one true God. The truth of this story is Moses, if he is the author, there may have been multiple authors here, but if whoever the author is pointing you to the truth of the one true God and pulling you away from the fallacies of these other little g gods. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's look at this real quick because I don't want to run out of time. I want you to see this because this, to me, this is really cool stuff. So what is it about these the numbers 7, 5, 3? What do they have in common? Right, so they have a center, right? They have a center. And if they have a center, It's going to point to somewhere. So I highlighted them here. And what would be really cool, wouldn't it be cool if like you followed these Hebrew words and they all landed and merged on one single text? Wouldn't that be amazing and like godlike? Well, guess what? It happens. And there it is. And so it points you have this chiasm within a chiasm, and it's pointing you to what is going on here. And when you take those Hebrew words, it essentially makes this phrase: whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. Do you remember the chiasm of the larger narrative? God will remember. And then the chiasm of the smaller narrative, it's focused around this rainbow, and it's focused around remembering, God remembering. So you have the center rainbow, the center cloud, the center covenant, the center earth, middle earth. You have all these centers, and there are a few things that come out of that. Number one is it's centered around this whole idea of this rainbow and this whole new idea of like, what is this thing? The Hebrew doesn't say rainbow. There's no Hebrew word for rainbow. It just says bow. We don't have a word that's for rainbow. It's just interpretive here. So God is saying, whenever I see my bow in the clouds, I'm going to put my bow in the clouds. Now, what is a bow? It's a weapon that does what? It kills. A weapon is meant to destroy, whether a human, whether an animal, whatever. That's what weapons do. They destroy. It's a weapon of destruction. And God says, I'm going to put my bow in the clouds. Now, if you think about that bow, which way is that bow pointing? Up. Up. It's facing upwards, away from the earth. So God says, I'm going to put my bow in the clouds. And when you look up in the clouds, that bow is pointing up. And there are all kind of allusions to Jesus here. But God says, never again am I going to destroy the earth. I'm putting my bow in the clouds, and I'm turning the bow on myself. Crazy, isn't it? And what I find so interesting about this is, remember, we would expect to see the Sabbath day represented here, because we saw the 6th. You would expect to see a 7th. But this is what you get right after that. So this entire paragraph ends up being about, we can rest. We don't. See, you have a God in the Genesis narrative who knows when to stop creating. You get a God who on day 7 knows when it's time to rest. And here you get another story, and it's showing you a God who knows when to stop destroying. It's a God who knows when to rest. And so he puts a sign here, a sign of the covenant in the clouds to remind him and to remind us that he will not do this again. You have a God who knows when to stop. And that's important for the people reading this letter, because all they know of are destructive gods. All they know of are gods who don't know when to stop. Gods who have their own vanity at play. Gods who have their own wills at play. Gods who are out for human destruction. And the author of Genesis is saying, no, this God knows when to rest. Now, there was another part here that I want to point out before we're out of time. And this is there's so much. I wish we had a ton of time to kind of walk through this. But the other part that we pointed out at the center of this larger chiasm is this idea of remembering. I'm going to remember my covenant, remember my covenant, remember my covenant. It's like, why does God have to remember? What's the point here? Now, to understand that, you have to understand that in the ancient world of covenants, every covenant came with a sign. Even today, we make covenants with signs. That's why I have this on my finger right here. This is a sign of a covenant. When I see this, I'm like, oh yeah, I made a covenant with my wife. I don't do it so casually. That's right, yes. I need to work on this relationship. And I remember, no, but we make signs of covenants. So one interesting thing about that, in the ancient world, if you were the recipient of the covenant, you would have to be able to produce the sign of the covenant. It was your job as the recipient to have proof of the covenant you made with the originator of that covenant or the authority of that covenant. If the originator shows up one day and you can't prove that you have that covenant, if you can't provide the sign, the powerful party, the authority in that situation, is going to do whatever they want because you can't prove it. You don't have a document. You don't have a ring on. You don't have a rainbow. What God does in this story, and this is so amazing, God is clearly the authority here, right? God is clearly the initiator of this covenant. And so God says to this ancient world of covenants, he says, I'm going to put the signs in the clouds. It's going to be my bow, so you can't lose it. So you won't forget it. So not only am I going to provide the means of the covenant, I'm going to provide the sign of the covenant. I'm going to provide every part of this covenant. I'm going to turn it in on myself, and I'm going to remember that I will never do this again. And so when you compare this story to the stories of the likes of the Epic of Gilgamesh or any other flood story that they're used to, this God stands out amongst the other gods that they're used to as a God who's gracious, a God who's loving, a God who is altogether different. This God is unlike any other human. This God is unlike any other gods that have ever been written about, talked about, or told about. This God is God. And Moses wants to show you that. This God is not angry with you. And that is such an important thing for you to know. Because we are so reluctant and we fall back in this pattern. It doesn't matter how long we've been Christians, of feeling that God is out to get us and that God is angry with us. And you have story after story after story showing you that God is not angry with you. And it's amazing to me that you can even take a story about how God wipes everybody off the face of the earth, and it's a story about how God is not angry at humankind. Isn't that amazing? And that God is remembering. And remember, one of my favorite, or not one of my favorite, but one of the bizarre stories, one of the bizarre statements to me is one of the lines that we brought up at the beginning is this line, every inclination of the human heart, and then at the end of the story, the phrase shows up again, only this time it shows up with a different statement behind it. Look at this. At the beginning of the story, God regretted making humanity because every inclination of the human heart was evil all the time. But by this time the story is done, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil, he says, I will not destroy earth. So it starts out, man, I regret it. The story ends with, yeah, I got to stop. Never again. Amanda?
I think it's interesting too to see, like, we see kind of the human perspective and God's perspective.
Absolutely.
Like, I think that part of that the Lord regretted. I mean, as Jewish people, I'm sure they thought, well, God regret. You know, there's that. It's kind of our human perspective, like, and then the God remembering. They felt forgotten, and then we see that all throughout the Bible, time and time again. We see people saying, "Where are you, God? Remember me." You know.
Yeah.
And so part of that is our perspective. Did God really forget? You know, and like you said, he's giving that as a reminder. But we feel forgotten so often, you know, or we feel like God regrets us or whatever. And so I love it. We see this is what you see. This is your perspective. But look what God does in that. You know.
Yes, and I think a big part, we're given this language so that we can understand the nature of God. Obviously God doesn't forget, and God wasn't working in a shed and forgot Noah was out on a raft. It's just, this language is given to us in human form so that we can understand it and understand who this God is. Trey, and then I'm going to just say one more thing. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
All of these other gods that they had no real relationship with other than, you giving a reward based.
Right.
For us to understand, God didn't feel sadness in this. God did, he had those feelings for what was going on.
100%. And I think we have an advantage when reading this story compared to the original audience. They've been beaten, they've been enslaved, they've been trashed. And so we have Christ, we have the Holy Spirit in us, we have this language, this mindset. They are so beat up, Paul.
Thank goodness the oral tradition
Yeah,
works,
right,
because if we didn't have that oral tradition from the early Israelite community,
yeah,
we wouldn't have this idea of God.
right,
It'd be the same as the other ones.
right,
And we see a very personal, gracious God, even one that sort of feels bad about what he's done.
right.
You know, I don't know how far we want to go with that, but
Yeah. But the image of God that you're being given is God is not who you think he is. You are not who you think you are. Creation is not what you think it is. The author here is turning this story upside down, turning everything, it's almost everything we know, it's like you have to think about it differently to truly understand who God is. We're out of time. I appreciate your comments. Love you all. Go get your coffee and donuts.